Speaking of more generic types, as a little bonus, you could say, I want to point your direction at a couple of built-in types TypeScript ships with, which utilize generic types, or which are generic types that give us certain utility functionalities. So there's a little bonus here, and from time to time, these special types might come in handy. Now, attached you find a link to the full documentation of all the built-in utility types. Here, I just want to give you a few examples. Now, just as all these type things, these types only exist in TypeScript world and therefore only prior to compilation. But during this compilation step, they can give you extra type safety or extra flexibility. For example, there's the built-in partial type. Let's say we have a new type, a new interface which we define, or a custom type, really doesn't matter, course goal. The course goal does have a title, which should be a string, and let's say a description, which should also be a string. Maybe we also have a complete until property, which is a date. Now we want to have a function, let's say, create course goal, which creates us such an object. Of course, we could have created a class as well, but we have such a function because in that function we might be drawing in some data from a database or whatever it is. So we have this function, and in the end here, I want to get my title, which is a string. I might get my description, which is a string, and I hopefully get my date, which is a date. Now in that function, of course, we could return an object where we just set up all these things. So where we set title to title, description to description, and complete until to date. We could do all of that, and if we then defined that this function will always return a course goal, we would have a correctly set up function. Now for some reason, let's say we're not doing it like this though. We're not doing this all in one step. Instead, what I want to do is I want to start by creating a variable here, which holds an empty object, and then step by step, I want to add my title here, I want to add my description here, and I want to add my date here. Now here I'm getting errors because of course I can't set title. This is not a property of this object, and whilst this works in vanilla JavaScript, TypeScript doesn't really like that on the fly adding here. So we might want to say that this should be of type course goal here. Now TypeScript is not complaining about this, but about the fact that this is an empty object, which clearly is not fitting our type here. So in the end, I want to return it, and I want to add all these things step by step, maybe because we have extra validation before each step, and therefore want to add it like this. Now here's where the partial type can come in handy. We could say that course goal here should be a partial type, which in the end, thanks to generic types, will hold a course goal. Now what this does is it tells TypeScript that this is an object which in the end will be a course goal. But initially partial kind of wraps our own type and changes it to a type where all these properties are optional. That's what partial does. One of these built-in types TypeScript ships with. So it turns this into a type, which is also an object type, where all the properties are optional. Therefore, we can set this to an empty object initially and still add all these things step by step. The only problem is that in the end, we can't return this because now it's still of type partial course goal and not of type course goal. We can fix this by converting this to course goal with typecasting, because we know at this point of time we will have added all the data, so it will be a real course goal and not a partial one. Now, of course, this is a bit made up, but you could have scenarios like this where you want to temporarily switch one of your object types, one of your interfaces, to be optional only, to make sure that all the properties in there can be optional, only temporarily, and then the partial type would allow you to do that. Another built-in utility type which you have is the read-only type. That can also be very useful. Let's say we have an array of names, and in there I got Max and Sports. Now correctly TypeScript infers that this is a string array. Now what can we do? We can of course push menu on there, and probably I should change this to Anna and not Sports to have a name in there. So this works. Now let's say, however, I want to make sure that this is a locked array. We can't add more here. Now we can always add more here, but at least I want TypeScript to yell at me if I try it. Well, that's where we can use the read-only type. We could set this to read-only string array. With that, we tell TypeScript, well, what we store here is an array of strings, but it's also an array of strings which is read-only. So when we try to add something with push, or if we try to remove something with pop, we get errors because we're not allowed to do these things with this array. And this is not limited to arrays, by the way. You can also use read-only on an object, for example, to mark it as read-only so that you're not allowed to change the properties or add new properties to this object. So this can also be very, very handy and give you more flexibility or be more precise about what you're aiming to do in your code. Now, all these are just utility types that only exist in TypeScript world, so they're not compiled to anything, but during compilation, they give you extra strictness or extra checks, or skip certain checks as we did it with partial. Now, you got more than read-only and partial, and as I mentioned, attached you find the documentation to a full list of these utility types. In certain scenarios, they can come in really handy, and therefore I definitely did not want to hide them from you, but instead, you should be aware of them so that you can use them when you need to lock something down, or, as in the case of partial, open anything up, or with all the other ones which I didn't discuss here, if you got some other operation which can be enhanced with one of these built-in utility types. And these utility types are all generic because what they do is they take some other value which is of any type and do something with it. They set everything to optional. They lock it down, not caring about whether this is an array or object or an array of strings, array of numbers, and so on. That's why these are generic. And together with the other built-in generics we saw earlier and your own generics, this now hopefully also again helps you understand why generics can be useful and why they exist.